So a couple weeks ago, my 16-year-old son, Conley, came to me and said, "Dad, you were alive during 9/11. Do you remember it?" And probably like many of you, I told him, not only do I remember it, I know exactly where I was. I know exactly what that room looked like. I know exactly what the phone call was like that I got to tell me to turn on the TV. I remember exactly what it felt like to see those images on the TV. I remember what happened later that day as we gathered together and there are no planes flying overhead. I remember what it was like when those first planes did come over, when they released that ban on air travel. Like many of you, moments like that got seared into my memory. And like you, they still feel pretty vivid, right? And so I asked him, I said, why are you asking, after we talked about that, why asking this particular question? He said, well, I like history, he said, and I've been reading about these things that happen, and it occurred to me that I know people who were there, and I wanted to know what it felt like, what it was like to be there. There are moments in our life, you don't need me to tell you this, but there are moments in our lives that sear into our memories because they are the end of a world. A moment when everything changes and something new has begun. 9/11 was certainly one of those when we watch those towers fall, but you have other ones in your life too that you have experienced and you remember. Maybe it was the moon landing. Maybe it was VE Day. Maybe it was Columbine or Sandy Hook. Maybe it was when the Cubs won the World Series. Sometimes these moments that get seared into our minds are happy and joyful. And man, sometimes they are heart-shattering too, aren't they? Because we have personal ones too. When the doctor says, "I'm so sorry." When someone dies. Moments that change things, and the whole world changes in a moment when one world ends and a new has begun. When everything changes at once. And you don't need me to be the one to tell you that this is part of life in our world today. I find it interesting to remember as we read stories about Jesus and about his disciples, to remember that they are all of them from towns and villages of probably less than 100 people. These are rural craftsmen and hand workers, and probably they've grown up largely around these tiny little villages. And as Pastor Erica told us last week, here at the end of our church year, which ends next week, we, in our gospel readings, have arrived in Jerusalem, where much of our readings have led us toward. And now they're in the great city, these men and women who grew up and lived in towns of less than 100 people. And today, they have arrived in the temple, which was the heart not just of their religion, but of politics, of their nation. This is the living, breathing heart of the world for them. In fact, this is where God's seat on earth is. This is the belly button, where earth is connected to heaven. And the temple looked like it. And for these men and women who had lived in towns of 100 people, I imagine walking into these grand environments with the giant stones, the crowds of people speaking in all kinds of languages and accents, the incense that wafts across, the sounds of the chanting and the drums and the music, the animals that are on their way into sacrifice, all of these things, the gold spatterings on the walls, the gems and the fancy gifts that have been given to the glory of God and not coincidentally also to the glory of the one who gave them. All of these things that made this look like God's address. And for these men and women who grew up in towns of 100, that must have been overpowering, don't you think? Here is God's address on earth, and it looks like it. And so no wonder these disciples are overwhelmed and call out to Jesus, "Teacher, look at this. What great stones, what grand decorations. This looks like it's worthy of God." But Jesus walking in something else has caught his eye that maybe hardly anybody else noticed. The disciples looking at the temple see a way to learn about God, but Jesus' eye got caught by something else that teaches about God. It's a little figure who's sort of ducking in between people there in the crowd as though she wants to get out without being seen. She's a widow, so she is very concerned about being in the crowd. She is desperately poor. And she has brought here in the middle of these crowds of people who are bringing to give to the temple from what is left, what they can afford. She has brought 3 little coins, which are everything she has. And I'm pretty sure nobody else saw her. But Jesus noticed and said, "That's where God is." Because here is someone whose faith and trust and love of and for and from God is such that she knows everything she has and everything she is belongs to God. And out of that joy of knowing who she is, out of that overwhelming sense of blessing and worship, she's brought everything she has to give to God. And Jesus sees this and loves her and knows this is trust. And of course, we talk about faith, it is trust. And he sees this commitment. And he sees that here is a woman who knows temples do not last, but God's mercy lasts forever. And it's maybe not too much to think that Jesus still has his eyes on her disappearing back as the disciples are turning to the temple and saying, "Teacher, doesn't this look like God?" And Jesus says, "You just missed it. Temples don't last, but you don't need me to tell you that. In this world, in this life, worlds end, and something new has already begun." The disciples look to the temple at this marvelous, beautiful decoration and say, "This must be where God's home is. Look how wonderful what we can do." And Jesus peeks under the rug. Because the truth is, we have always had wars with us, haven't we? And hatred and insurrections and violence. We shove them under the rug. Or we try to pretend that they're glory. We used to think war was glorious, all the poetry and stuff like that, until we realize how awful it is. But we'll tuck that under the rug there. And we have always had fear with us and hatred. We've always treated each other not the way that we would want to be treated, but we'll tuck that under. We have always had betrayal and families torn apart. We've always had people who are intimidated and offended by the merciful and the peacemakers, that the poor might be of value and that the hungry might be fed, but we'll tuck that under the rug, and we'll hide that there. We have always had in our midst leaders who need us to be afraid, who know if they can just make us afraid of the right people, they control us. And if they can get us to hate just the right thing about ourselves, we'll buy anything they're selling. And if they can make us believe that we are not enough in who we are, that we are somehow hollow and empty and a failure, we'll buy whatever it is, to the point we have to build an extra room for our Costco stuff. We have always had leaders and people trying to control us who say, I'm the only one who can save you. This miracle product is the only thing that can make life worth living. We've always had them, but we don't talk about that. We'll just tidy that up and put it under the rug. But Jesus sees what we hide. What has always been true of us and always with us, that we are broken people in a broken world. And these terrifying things that Jesus lists here are nothing more and nothing less what have always been with us. And when Jesus, looking at the temple, looks for where God's home is on earth, it's not in those grand stones that he sees, but his eyes slide a little bit outside of town, out beyond the walls, out to a hill that's waiting for a cross. Because Jesus knows that is where we will see God most clearly. For that is where Jesus will pull back the rug. And Jesus will take all of our awful bits and he will carry them to that hill in his own hands. And Jesus will stretch out his arms in the grace, mercy, love, and forgiveness that God gives so abundantly and freely. And taking our horrible bits, Jesus will give us his glory, his life, his blessing. All of the gifts and wonder of heaven for you today. Jesus will take our worst and give us his best. Because you see, in this life, worlds have always been ending. Those moments seared in our consciousness. The worlds have always been ending. And in the meantime, there is something new that's been here all along. Jesus has been inviting us into this kingdom all along, showing us what it looks like to live in a kingdom based on mercy and justice and joy and peace and love and forgiveness. A kingdom where the poor are valued, the hungry are filled, where those who weep are comforted. He's been showing us and inviting us into God's kingdom that has always been here. And when this world ends, this kingdom that Jesus has been teaching and showing us has always been here. It is a kingdom that's marked by scars, not perfection. And it's a kingdom in which our hope rests in those nail-scarred hands, because it always has been. This world, this life is filled with moments when worlds end. And a new world has been here all along. The world that Jesus has always been inviting us into. The world that Jesus has opened doors wide for us. This weekend, I went to Hospice House here in town to hold a friend because her husband had just died. And as she wept and I held her, I told her, "You have been strong for so long. You've been holding all these pieces for so long. I said, now it's time to fall apart. Now it's time to fall to pieces and let them go, because we will be the hands to gather them. And it's other hands that will hold you. And that has been our hope all along. As worlds end, there is something new that's been here all along, that does not depend on us controlling or being fancy or anything else, but simply depends on hands that are scarred by our weakness, our brokenness, that have been holding us together all this time. Amen.